Hello to everyone that's joining us today, and welcome to the Children's Policy Centre webinar series in conversation with Children's Commissioners. Today we have a very important conversation with Dr. Claire Achmad, who is the Chief Children's Commission from Aotearoa, which I never quite pronounce correctly, and Claire, please correct me, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Sharon Bessell. I'm Professor of Public Policy here at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, and I'm Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm joining today from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. In the work that we do at the Children's Policy Centre, we aim to engage genuinely and respectfully with the traditional owners of the lands on which we work, recognising the importance of connection to community and to country to all children and young people, but especially for First Nations children and young people. And today I pay my respects to elders past, present, and to emerging leaders. And I would like to acknowledge any Indigenous people who are joining us today. The Children's Policy Centre is based at the Australian National University, and we have three key objectives in the work that we do. The first is to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second, we seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, the well-being and the best interests of children. And third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. Our flagship program of research at the moment is the More for Children research, which aims to understand poverty from a child's standpoint and to measure poverty and its drivers in a way that's child-centred, and to respond to poverty in ways that are child-inclusive to ultimately end child poverty. And one of the issues that we'll discuss with Claire today is New Zealand's approach to child poverty. And I just encourage people to have a look at the issues papers that we've recently published on children's experiences of poverty, and particularly around issues of transport, housing and food security, and they're all on our website. And today I'm looking forward to learning much more about New Zealand's approach, not just to child poverty, but to children's rights more broadly. And to talk about those issues, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Claire Achmad. Claire is recognised as an advocate for children in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and internationally. She was appointed Children's Commissioner and Chair of the Commission of Aotearoa, New Zealand in November 2023. Claire holds degrees in arts and law from the University of Auckland and a PhD from Leiden University in the Netherlands. She's published widely on issues around children's rights. She's a wonderful advocate for children and a dear friend. Claire, welcome. It is so lovely to have you with us today.
Oh, kia ora, Sharon, and thank you so much for the warm introduction and the invitation to be here with you all. In the Indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, te reo Māori, I greet you, ka nui nui te mihi ki a koutou katoa, I huri noa I te motu o te whenua moe moe a. Ka nui nui te mihi ki a koutou katoa, ko Claire Indrawati Achmad tōku ingoa no Airani ko te rana me Indonesia a hau, ko te whangatu nui atara e noho ana. So that was just sharing a warm greeting to you all around your beautiful lands in Australia, acknowledging the different nations and mobs across your whenua, your land, and just shared a little bit about my whakapapa, my background. So on my dad's side, I'm Javanese from Indonesia. On my mum's side, I'm Irish and Scottish ancestry, and I'm joining you this afternoon from the beautiful lands of Te Atiawa, Taranaki Whānui, the iwi or the tribe here in Wellington, Te Whanganoia Tara in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire, for that beautiful introduction to yourself. And let me say again, welcome and selamat datang.
Terima kasih.
Claire, there's a lot that we want to hear about New Zealand's approach, but I wonder if we could begin by asking you to tell us just a little bit about your role as Commissioner and the mandate that you have. You know, in this series, we talk to children's commissioners across Australia and sometimes internationally, and those roles and mandates sometimes differ. So we'd love to hear what your role is.
Absolutely. So I've been in my role as Chief Children's Commissioner here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, since November last year. I've actually just had 1 year anniversary in the job. So you might say that I'm still pretty young into the role or new into the role. And it's been a fantastic and amazing first year, a big privilege and a responsibility to serve in this role. And I do that building on over 30 years of children's commissioners here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it's a really rich history of independent advocates in this role for children in our country. And in terms of my particular mandate today, so I lead Mana Mokopuna Children and Young People's Commission, and we have a number of really clear mandates and functions that we fulfill. So the first of those is to advocate independently for the rights, well-being and interests of children and young people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our act that we are governed by sets out a range of different tools that we have and ways of working to undertake that advocacy work. We also have a particular mandate around promotion and advancement of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I love that that is enshrined in our legislation that governs our commission. And as well, and this is another provision of our act that I just really value that's in the law, is a specific function and mandate around hearing the voices of children and young people and encouraging their participation in issues that matter to them. And then a particular role for us to amplify those forward to decision makers, but also to be alongside, in particular, government decision makers and agencies to encourage participation from children and young people in the work that they do. And in terms of the scope of our focus, so our commission focuses on all children in Aotearoa, New Zealand under the age of 18, so in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also have an extended mandate that covers children and young people under the age of 25 who have been in or who are in our care and protection and youth justice system. So a very particular focus there for those children and young people. And in our work and our ways of working, we are governed by a set of principles that are set out in our legislation. One of those being that we focus and recognise children and young people in their diversity in all forms. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember as the independent advocate for children and young people. Also, that we put a particular focus on the rights of mokopuna Māori. So those are Māori children, the Indigenous children of our land here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And also that we advocate grounded in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and with a focus on children who are experiencing disadvantage. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a snapshot in terms of our mandate, the focus that I bring in my work. If you play that forward in terms of what we are focusing on in our work, we've set ourselves 4 strategic advocacy aspirations for children and young people. And so those are focused on all children growing up safe and well, recognising the crucial nature of those first 2,000 days for all children. Every child growing up safe and well, so that's free of all forms of child maltreatment and as well safe in our state care and protection system, and for all children to have thriving mental health and support when they need it for their mental health. Every family and whānau growing being thriving, living free of poverty. And then our 4th area of focus, we called that participating in what matters to me. So that's really that big focus on child and youth participation. And we've heard from children and young people around our country that they want to be participating in things like their culture, their education, their sport and play and recreation, and also in protecting our environment as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's really helpful for us to frame this conversation by understanding the breadth and the depth of the work that you do. The fact that the convention is centering what you do is so incredibly important. And I wanted to begin by asking you a little about children's rights and how they're seen in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Before we go to that conversation, I will just say to our friends who are joining us online that there is time through this conversation, if you want to ask a question of Claire, if you would, please just pop it either into the Q&A or raise your hand. And we'll make sure that we've got some time for any questions that you might like to ask. But Claire, I wanted to begin by asking you a little about the way in which children's human rights are seen in New Zealand. You talk about the way in which it shapes the work that you do. And I think, if we think about the Australian context, in some quarters there is a very strong commitment to children's human rights, but we also see across the population considerable levels of scepticism. And at a national level, we ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990, but have yet to translate it into law in substantive ways. How are children's human rights viewed in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Is there a broad-based commitment to children's human rights, or is that something that's an ongoing process?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that Australia ratified the convention in 1990 because New Zealand followed relatively close on your heels in 1993. And I think that if you think about where we are today in 2024, I'd say that it's still an ongoing evolution in terms of how we really focus on upholding and protecting and fulfilling children's rights here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There's many things that we do really well, and the good thing is in our country that the majority of children and young people, they are thriving, they are experiencing their full range of rights. But if we look at a certain proportion of our child population here in our country, they aren't experiencing all of their rights in all circumstances at all times as they should be. And so there's definitely room for growth. I think that's at multiple levels in society. So I think I observe that there's still a lack of awareness and understanding amongst children and young people themselves as to the fact that they are rights holders and that there is this magical document called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which establishes rights for them. I think as well there is still a growing understanding of children's rights amongst families and whānau. That's our Indigenous word for families. And so I think at that societal level too, you see that playing out, that there's still not a true culture of respecting and upholding children's rights here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so I always like to remind our team here at Mana Mokopuna and the work that we do, that we have a big role to play in helping to, I guess, activate and galvanise that real culture and momentum for children's rights here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then I guess if you look at the system level too, there's still a ways to go. We still don't, for example, have a process by which for every policy and new policy or amended policy or new piece of law or amended legislation, we still don't have a process of undertaking, for example, a mandatory child impact assessment to really hone in on children's rights and put them front and centre. We do have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child reflected in certain pieces of legislation, for example, our child protection legislation, but we still don't have full incorporation of the convention here in New Zealand like they have gone forward with in a place like Scotland, for example. So I think there is definitely still room for growth. In many places around the world, we have child-friendly cities where there has been that true commitment to making a city a place that is really child-friendly. I think that for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have around 5.2 million people here in our population, and around 1.23 of those are children. We're small enough to actually be a child rights-friendly country, and so that's really where I want to see us go.
Claire, I'm listening to you talk and I reflect in Australia there are policy areas where we start to see the influence of the UN Convention and ideas of children's human rights. And that's a very positive thing. We see it here as well around child protection and out-of-home care. At least in policy, we still have a way to go to translating that to practice. But where we often don't see children considered, and we certainly don't see anything like child or child rights impact statements, is the policy areas where we might not think children are impacted. And yet, employment policy and legislation, housing, as you've said, planning and urban planning are areas that critically impact children. And so we really need to be thinking about how all of those policies impact on children, their human rights and their day-to-day lives.
Correct. I mean, the reality is that children's lives, like all of our lives, they don't take place in silos. And I think one of the powerful aspects of the convention is that it really highlights the interdependent and indivisible nature of children's rights. And that, when a decision is made over here, for example, on transport policy, it's going to have an impact over here on the child's right to education, for example, the ability to get to school or to engage in education often relies on transport and how that policy works. And so that's just one example of, the many ways that we see these interdependencies in children's rights playing out. And I think that far too often there's not enough consideration given to a holistic view of children's lives. And I think that the convention and children's rights, it's actually a powerful tool for us to harness so that we can surface some of those issues and actually give due consideration to how potential policy decisions or legislative change is going to play out in the real lives of children. Because when it comes down to it, that is what children's rights are about. How do we ground those and make those promises real in the everyday experiences of children and young people? And, often lately I've been hearing in the conversations that I've been having around our country, children and young people have been talking about the importance, for example, of public spaces and decisions that are made in their communities. For example, I was in a small rural town called Aotearoa a few weeks back, meeting with the youth council there. And some of the youth councillors were talking to me about some of the important public spaces in their life there in Aotearoa, and how some of the decision making was really taking into consideration how they, as children and young people, use those spaces and what they want to see out of those spaces. And so that was really heartening to hear that their views were being incorporated and helping to shape some of those community decisions. And I think we see the positive impacts when children and young people are able to be heard and have their views taken into consideration in some of those decisions that affect them. Because, if you think about it, to be honest, so many decisions that are made at the local, regional, and national level, they do impact on children in their lives, but often children and their rights are invisible in those conversations. And so that's partly, my role and the role of other advocates in the work that we do to make children's rights visible, to bring children and young people into those conversations and to actually advocate to have their rights and interests at the very heart of those decision-making processes.
Claire, I wanted to shift our attention to a particular issue where New Zealand has been the focus of, I think, international attention, certainly attention here in Australia in very positive ways, and that is around child poverty. New Zealand adopted a Child Poverty Reduction Act in 2018, and in Australia there's been growing interest in the possibilities for us to follow a similar pathway. Claire, what did that act legislate? What did the act aim to achieve?
I think this is such an interesting issue in children's rights, especially on a trans-Tasman kind of basis. And I have been watching with interest, the discussion in Australia and some of the moves around a focus on child poverty. So first of all, I just want to say, we'd say kia kaha, be strong in that work and that focus, because it is so important. I think reflecting for us on the Child Poverty Reduction Act that was passed in 2018 in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that was a real win for children's rights and for children in this country. The key thing that it put in place was the architecture and the system by which to make poverty that affects families and children invisible, and to keep a consistent and continued focus by successive governments on this issue of poverty affecting children. And the fact that architecture and framework, which is made up of a series of child poverty reduction targets, a range of measures by which we seek to measure progress on child poverty, and then underpinned by a child and youth wellbeing strategy. I think the fact that those things are embedded in law is a really positive aspect that we just can't underestimate the impact of. Of course, then it relies on, successive governments being committed to implementing and making progress under that framework. But I think the fact that it's enshrined in legislation is powerful in and of itself. And we saw that Act passed in 2018 with cross-party consensus across the political divide here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So sending a strong message as well that child poverty is unacceptable here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I think those two things taken together are really, really important aspects of this legislation.
Claire, can you share with us a little more detail on the indicators that were chosen to measure progress towards ending child poverty, what the indicators were, but also how the indicators were determined? Is that something that there was considerable debate on? Was that something that you were able to develop a consensus on relatively easily?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the measures, first of all, so there's a suite of measures that are inbuilt into the Child Poverty Reduction Act. And these are a mix of after housing costs and before housing costs child poverty measures, also measures around material hardship, for example. And I think it's really important to have that suite of measures in the legislation because it gives us a view into the different aspects of child poverty and how poverty can play out in children's lives. And if we look at our most recent official child poverty statistics here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we see that around close to half of the children who are living in poverty and experiencing poverty are actually living in working family households. And so that's a really important aspect that having this suite of measures helps us to understand. Should have said earlier as well that the Child Poverty Reduction Act requires this measurement to occur and for annual child poverty statistics at the national level to be published. And that has happened, and those are broken down by ethnicity as well, which helps us further to disaggregate and understand who in our child population is really experiencing the impact of poverty. And then when it comes to the indicators, which is what you were asking about, Sharon, so one of the aspects of the bill which changed as it was going through the legislative process was to have a range of child poverty related indicators included in the legislation. And so that is positive as well, I think, because it gives us a view into the things that we know play into or are sort of those underlying social determinants of health and well-being that often feed into a situation of a child experiencing poverty. So these are things like child hospitalizations, rates of child hospitalizations that are avoidable, and also things like food insecurity. And so right there you can see that those indicators help to make the experience of poverty for children tangible. And every year under the legislation, we have an annual child poverty report that is tabled in Parliament, and it brings forward an annual view of how we are tracking on both those indicators and also those measures, and then reaching the overall targets, how we're tracking towards those.
And Claire, can you talk us through how that bipartisan support for the Act was achieved? And is this something that came through political leadership? Was it something that came through advocacy within the community? Was it led by, I think Russell Wills was the commissioner at the time? Is it something that was led by the commissioner? You know, how did the advocacy and the political will to adopt the Act come about?
Great question. And from an advocacy perspective, I think it's really important to always think about the different ingredients that go into getting something like this across the line over time, because it's never really just one particular thing. It's often, a range of people working from a range of different perspectives or corners, I guess, with that common goal and commitment in mind. So here I do want to acknowledge the leadership of our then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who really did make a focus on getting this act into legislation and getting it across the line in a bipartisan way. She really did make that a big focus. One of the portfolios that she took on herself was as the First Minister of Child Poverty Reduction under this Act. But I think as well, it was the willingness of leaders and portfolio holders from across political parties to really work in a consensus-based way around this particular issue. We saw through the general election process in 2017 that the advocacy that had been led over many years from the Children's Commissioner, from civil society, from academia, we saw that really come to a head in the general election campaign of 2017, and ending child poverty really did become a core issue in that general election campaign. And I remember that through one of the leaders' debates where Jacinda Ardern and Bill English, who was leader of the National Party at the time, they both made really clear their commitment to wanting to see an end to child poverty in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think that sent a really strong message, and also it meant that this issue was really on the radar of the voting public as well. So I think it was a positive time for children, because this big issue affecting so many children's lives was front and centre in our general election process and campaign that year. And then I guess just to speak to a little bit of the advocacy that went on for many years prior to this, because it really was a multi-year effort. And I guess that's one thing that I'd emphasise to you all across the Tasman, that this was a sustained effort in advocacy for children. And so if you wind back to 2013, a partnership was created called the Child Poverty Monitor, that involved the Children's Commissioner, a philanthropic trust here in Aotearoa, New Zealand called the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, and also the Child and Youth Epidemiology Service of the University of Otago here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that sought to provide an advocacy platform about the rights of children, collate the evidence base to support raising awareness of the impacts of poverty, and it took on that measurement role of child poverty before we had a Child Poverty Reduction Act. But really the roots of this, it does go back to some of the work of previous children's commissioners. And so over that 10-year partnership, there were three different children's commissioners. So Dr. Russell Wills, he established an expert advisory group on solutions to child poverty, and it made a really landmark report in 2012, 78, I think, specific recommendations around how child poverty could be addressed in our country. And many of those recommendations, you can see the direct flow through into the 2018 Child Poverty Reduction Act. And I think that really did start to help to significantly raise the awareness of this problem of child poverty in the public mind, but also the things that we needed to put in place to address and ultimately, hopefully, end poverty in New Zealand. And then the Children's Commissioner who followed on from Dr. Wills, that was Judge Andrew Beecroft, he continued that child poverty monitor partnership. And he really, I guess, simplified the message around child poverty. He helped decision makers to see that the majority of children in the country were doing well, but the significant proportion were really struggling with poverty. He also started to put a really strong focus on how poverty and other child rights challenges were affecting our mokopuna Māori, so Māori children in our country. And then picking up the rako, or the baton, as we like to say, from Judge Beecroft was Judge Frances Evers. And her role in this was really to bring in those voices of children and young people and put a focus on what was the lived experience of children and young people when it came to this experience of poverty. And I remember attending, when I was working in civil society, the launch of a child poverty monitor report, I think in 2022, that was held at a marae, so a traditional Māori meeting house in Tamaki Makaurau, our biggest city of Auckland. And that event was led by children and young people themselves, who brought forward their calls to action on what needed to change to address child poverty. And then I guess in my role now, I've continued on that strong history of advocating for an end to child poverty here in our country. And my call to action to our government and to successive governments has been commit to making ending child poverty an ongoing project of national significance. And what I mean by that is work at a political cross-party consensus to commit to maintaining that focus on ending child poverty, put in place policies that the evidence and the data and the research shows will work, and prioritise children and put them at the centre of decision making so that no child is experiencing poverty. So sorry, Sharon, that was a bit of history to cover, but I hope it gives a bit of depth of insight as to the journey that we've travelled here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when it comes to this issue. We are certainly not in a perfect situation today. Still we have over 12.5% on average of children living in material hardship, for example. So we've still got a long way to go, but we have this strong history and commitment now to saying poverty that affects children and families is completely unacceptable. We need to change that, and it does take collective and sustained action.
It's incredibly helpful background, Claire, and I think also reminding us that this is often a long-term process to bring about change. One of the things that I think is really significant is the broad consensus to saying we cannot accept child poverty. And I think one of the challenges that we still have in Australia is the view that people make bad choices. And I say that in inverted commas, but this idea around individual responsibility and blame, which has been prominent in discourse around poverty in Australia for at least 2.5 decades. And of course, that's a harder argument to sustain when we're talking about children, but we still see this idea of individual and individual family responsibility being raised in some conversations around ending poverty generally, but also ending child poverty. Were those kinds of narratives there in New Zealand when you started, when the campaign started to end child poverty? And has that shifted?
I definitely think that those kinds of narratives were there. I think that through, the journey that I spoke about, I think that the issue of poverty is much more in the public consciousness now. And I think there is at a certain, to a certain degree, there is an understanding that, that that's just unacceptable. But then I think that I'm very mindful that collective will and that collective lack of acceptance for poverty affecting children, that's fragile and it can't be taken for granted. And I do think that, over these years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen some of that, I guess, consensus start to break down a little bit, not helped, of course, by, the rise of misinformation and disinformation, and also not helped, of course, by the significant impacts of the cost of living crisis and how that is playing out for families and therefore for children and young people as well. I think that in terms of the advocacy that is needed here, it really needs to be sustained. And so that's why I'm mindful in my role that I can't take my eye off continuing to push forward and advocate strongly at the public level, directly to government decision makers and in our communities as to why this sustained focus on ending child poverty is so important. And I think as well, drawing out and growing an understanding of the impacts of I guess of the drivers that underlie poverty, things like the ongoing impacts of colonisation for our Indigenous people, things like the impact of intergenerational trauma, and then as I referred to before, the fact that whilst employment in and of itself and being in the workforce is certainly an important ingredient that can help to address poverty, when we have such a high proportion of children who are showing up in those poverty statistics, who live in families and whānau in households where their parents or their caregivers, they are in work. We need to look at the wider picture here and recognise that there are other factors at play that need to be addressed. And I think as well the connection between, housing and poverty is a really crucial one to draw out as well. We know that the right to housing is a human right that all people have, including children and young people. But right now in our country, such a significant group of children and young people are living in insecure, unaffordable, unhealthy housing. And we see a correlation between, experiencing that kind of housing deprivation and experiences of poverty. And one other group that I didn't refer to yet is our disabled children and young people, our mokopuna whaikaha, as we refer to them in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I mentioned before that on average 12.5% of children and young people are living in material hardship. What the statistics also show us is that really jumps up for our children and young people who are disabled. So we have 22.3% of children who are in material hardship, they are experiencing a disability. And so again, we have to look at the intersectional nature of this issue. And I think if we go back to the question that you posed, Sharon, I think that public level of understanding about how these issues intersect, it's still needing to grow in that real consciousness around how these issues play out in the lives of particular groups of children.
Yeah, Claire, I mean, we see very similar things in Australia around intersectionality and also around housing. You know, the research that we're doing with children about their experiences of poverty, housing is so prominent. And for people who are interested, we've just published a paper on children's experiences of housing when they're growing up in contexts of poverty. And when you don't have safe and secure housing, everything else falls apart. So it's such a crucial issue. Claire, we've got a question in the Q&A which asks about the survey that New Zealand uses to measure and understand and respond to poverty. The question's asking for perhaps a little bit more information around how the survey works, and also asks if recent changes to the frequency of the survey have had an effect on the data that are being provided through that work.
Mm. Great question. Thanks for asking it, because I think this issue of measurement of child poverty is a really important one, and one that's often overlooked. And I think if we make the connection to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the general measures of implementation, it's so clear the importance of good data around children and their lives and their experience of their rights. But far too often that measurement and that gathering of sound data about children and their rights is too often overlooked. And certainly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you know, every time I see a kind of OECD report or an international report that lines up, you know, how we're performing in relation to other countries on certain aspects of children's rights, it pains me when some of the fields say data not available for Aotearoa New Zealand. So we've got a ways to go. But when it comes to child poverty reduction measurement, the primary vehicle that is undertaken through is something called our Household Economic Survey. I think the name's recently been updated actually, but I can't quite remember what it's called. But that's been the measurement tool that has been used, and that's undertaken by our Stats NZ, which is the equivalent to your Australian Bureau of Statistics. And so that is intended to give a well-rounded view of, you know, what's happening in the economic situation of a household, and then it drills down into some particular questions around children, obviously. One particular thing I want to highlight here, because this was a big focus of some advocacy that I led earlier in the year, was that there was a fantastic survey that was developed called the Living in Aotearoa survey, which would have given a longitudinal view around persistent poverty in children's lives. And that was designed with a particular focus on children from the ground up. A lot of work went into making sure that that would be a really strong way of engaging and understanding that longer term experience of poverty, which is the case for many families. Unfortunately, the funding from that survey was pulled earlier in the year, and so that survey has now been sort of rolled back in to the Household Economic Survey. And so that's, again, I guess just one example that shows how fragile some of these things are. That even when we have a framework that is embedded in legislation and requires that measurement, sometimes that measurement of poverty is one of the first things to go. So it's good that we still have the ongoing measurement of child poverty more broadly, but unfortunate that we're not going to get that real richness, I think, into that longer term experience, that longitudinal view of poverty in children's lives.
Thanks, Claire. I think for Australia, there's so much that we can learn from New Zealand's experience. And I wanted to kind of move to kind of children's human rights and children's policy a little bit more broadly. And the current government came to power in November of last year, about the same time as you came into your position. And so the government of Aotearoa, New Zealand, is now led by the Centre-Right National Party in coalition with the Conservative ACT and also New Zealand First in that coalition. I wonder if you could just talk us through what changes we've seen, if any, to policy that impacts on children's human rights, child poverty over the past year. Maybe we can start with the positives. Have there been positive changes that we see?
Sure. Yeah, it has been quite a significant time of change here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and obviously that any government has impacts on children and their rights and their lives. When it comes to the positives, yes, there have been some positives that I celebrate. So, for example, we have now the first ever Minister for Mental Health in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's great as well that that particular minister also holds the portfolio as the Minister of Youth. So something really positive there. Recently as well, there's been a commitment by the government to invest in and undertake Aotearoa New Zealand's first ever prevalence study into child and youth mental health. And so that really potentially promises to be quite a game changer in understanding levels of prevalence in different mental health struggles and conditions here amongst our child and youth populations. So that's definitely a win for children and positive both on the, I guess, focus on children's rights, but also on that good data and measurement of issues affecting children. As well, there has been a recent commitment from the government around a deeper focus on prevention of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and also, again, investing in understanding the prevalence of FASD as well as prevention. So those are some of the positive things that I can point to, and I think it's important, in my role as Chief Children's Commissioner, that when the government undertakes positive work impacting on children, that I celebrate those things, I welcome those things as I do. Alongside that, yes, there have absolutely been some challenges, and yeah, happy to speak to that a little bit now, if you like, Sharon.
Yeah, please do, because we learn from the positives and we learn from the challenges. So.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think one particular area that has been a challenge that has come to the fore has been in the care and protection space. And here in particular, honing in on a policy that a policy and then a legislative reform that's currently going through our parliament, which would see a particular provision of our Child Protection Act, the Oranga Tamariki Act, repealed. And this is what's known as Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act, and it puts a particular focus on the rights and the well-being of mokopuna Māori who are within the state care and protection system. It requires, for example, the Chief Executive of our Child Protection Department to report transparently on efforts to reduce the numbers of mokopuna Māori in our state care system and the efforts that are being made to uphold the rights of mokopuna Māori. And it also puts a onus on the state care and protection system to uphold some particular principles that really give life to a te ao Māori, a Māori worldview and perspective when it comes to protecting children and young people. So those in particular are principles around whanaungatanga, so relationships with the wider whānau and kin network being cared for within that network, and also on something called mana tamaiti, which is the inherent mana, the standing and the recognition that every Māori child is a treasure, a taonga. So the fact that some of that is potentially going to be repealed, that this provision is being taken out of the legislation potentially, is a real challenge from a mokopuna Māori and a Māori whānau perspective, and something that I've been very clear I don't want to see that happen.
Claire, I think this is where we share similar challenges across the Tasman, and certainly in Australia. The number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are removed from their families remains not just a challenge, a national disgrace. In Australia, this is going to be when we look back in history, another stolen generation, I would argue. And we also see the terrible overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the justice system. As you've seen some of those really important principles being challenged and the likelihood of them being repealed, what has been the public discourse around that? Has there been opposition to that, or is there silence? What kind of response are you seeing among the population?
So there was a select committee process that was undertaken a few months ago on this particular provision and its potential repeal. And I think that the pushback was really strong. The message from so many people throughout our country has been clear. Don't take away this important provision of this act, which really places that very clear focus on our Māori children, our Indigenous children, and that advocacy has come really strongly from whānau Māori themselves, from iwi and hapu, that's tribes and sub-tribes, many of which who have advocated so powerfully and strongly about the positive impact that this provision has been having. I was right there alongside them, amplifying those calls. Also here, I want to emphasise that children and young people themselves who are in the care system or who have been in our care system, many of them have been advocating to the government to not make this repeal, not let this repeal go forward. Many who are themselves mokopuna Māori, but we've also heard from children and young people who aren't Māori. They have been advocating for this provision to be protected as well. And then I guess more widely alongside this, another issue that has been challenging from a children's rights perspective over the past few months has been in the youth justice space. And I think there's interconnections between some of what I've been talking about when it comes to the rights of mokopuna Māori in the youth justice space as well, because we know from our data and statistics that a really high proportion of children and young people in our youth justice space are Māori children, are our Indigenous children. And so some of the policy and legislative reforms in the youth justice space I have been raising significant concern about from a children's rights perspective. This includes things like creating a new category under our law called a young serious offender category, and judges being able to sentence children and young people to something called a military style academy for a quite significant length of time. Now, there are some positive aspects of that so-called military-style academy approach. I've been pleased to see in the pilot that's been undertaken recently that there has been a trauma-informed, multidisciplinary, therapeutic and wraparound approach happening. But what I continue to advocate for is that we don't need a military component to be part of how we deliver youth justice in this country. And so some of these moves and policy proposals are unfortunately taking us further and further away from a child rights upholding youth justice system, taking us in the wrong direction from where we really should be going. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child was really clear in its concluding observations just last year to the government in February 2023 that significant work needs to be done to bring Aotearoa New Zealand's justice system in line with a children's rights approach and to be consistent with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So some of these aspects have been very concerning to see from a children's rights perspective.
Claire, we began by talking about some of the real gains that have been made over time around children's right to a reasonable standard of living by reducing child poverty and about gains in child rights generally. But you made the important point that there's often a fragility to those gains, and those examples that you just gave are so powerful in highlighting that fragility. This is a really difficult question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can sustain efforts to advance children's human rights and how we can systematically embed the gains that are made.
Love that question. And gosh, it's a big one. So I know we can't be here all afternoon talking about this, but I guess I'd probably boil it down to three things at this point in time. The first one, I think, is to continue growing that collective consciousness around children's rights and also around the importance of respecting, protecting, valuing children, really seeing children and young people, as those treasures, those taonga that they are to be cherished, nurtured, and loved. And that collective consciousness around if we really fulfill children's rights in all circumstances at all times, it's going to really propel us in positive directions as communities, as a society, and not least for children and young people themselves. I think the second thing is the importance of taking an intergenerational view. And here, I think if we remember that a child who is born today is very likely still going to be alive in the year 2100, I think that puts it into perspective. It is children and young people who are going to inherit the impacts of the decisions that are made today. They are going to be dealing with those consequences for the longest time. So it just makes sense that we bring them into the picture and put them front and center now in making those decisions. So whenever I'm talking with decision makers across our government, for example, I'm encouraging them to take that intergenerational and that long-term view. And I hope that that can help to bridge some of that thinking that I think often, unfortunately, happens in, we have a 3-year electoral term here in New Zealand. It's a short-termism problem that we often have. So taking that longer-term view is important. And then the third thing that I really strongly advocate for here is to embed children and young people's participation and voices in everything that we do. As adults, I think that we have an obligation to facilitate and be alongside children and young people to create the spaces and the places for their views to be heard, for them to participate in the decision making that is important and is going to impact on their lives. And I thought I'd just briefly bring in a quote from a child who we've heard through some of our work. And they shared with us, and I quote, "For my voice and others to be heard, we need people like you to listen and take the things we say, not just in one ear and out the other, not making promises you know you can't keep, but being honest with us." So I think we have to really attend to that and hone in and make a recommitment, a deeper commitment to really being alongside children and young people, to encourage their participation, to really meaningfully hear what they've got to say, and then to take those things forward in decision making that is ultimately, hopefully, going to serve them well, help to uphold their rights.
Yeah, they're wonderful insights, and that quote is amazing. And I think the children that we work with, when they talk about participation, rarely want to be left to make decisions for themselves. They want to be genuinely and meaningfully part of conversations about the things that matter to them. And I must say, Claire, when I hear you say so powerfully that a child born today will still be alive in 2100, it focuses the mind on climate emergency and what we are not doing. And that's, I think, a conversation for another day, but one that we would love to invite you back to have with us.
I would love that. It's such an important issue, and I hear it so often from children and young people.
Yeah. I think today we are going to have to start to bring this conversation to a close, although I think we could talk for many hours yet. Claire, in closing the conversation, you're 1 year into a 5-year term. I wonder if you could share with us what your hopes are for children and young people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, over the next 4 years. What would you like the situation to be in 4 years' time?
It really goes back to our vision that we hold true to here in our commission in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that is kia kuru poinamu te rongo, that all mokopuna, all children live their best lives. And I think to really see that, I want every single person in this country to hold the highest aspirations for our children and young people, to remember that every child comes into this world with boundless potential, and that the decisions that we make as adults and in government systems, they can really have a huge impact on either propelling forward that boundless potential or closing some of that boundless potential down. So I believe that significant change can be made here in our country like it can in Australia. I think it really goes to continuing to build that movement for children's rights, build a collective momentum around how we value and respect and treat children and young people, and also that we truly deeply listen to what children and young people are saying, and to be alongside them to really take forward their many creative and wisdom laden solutions to some of these really big challenges in their lives and in our lives as a society and communities.
Claire, that is such a powerful message for us to end on. I think it's a message that is as relevant to Australia and many other countries across the world as it is to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, to hear New Zealand's experiences. Thank you so much for sharing with us your expertise, your experience, your insights, and your passion. It has been a real pleasure. And to everyone joining us today, thank you. We hope to see you again. Thanks so much, Claire.
Ngā mihi, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.